got this rat, this gnawing, key-eating fucking rat. And it brings up questions.
Noam Chomsky, and this is Alternative Radio. I'm David Bar-Samyan. This edition of AR features Noam Chomsky on War Crimes and Imperial Fantasies, Part 1. When official enemies of the United States commit crimes, they must be punished. That is an unquestioned staple of public discourse. Occasionally, as in the torture and killing of prisoners in Cuba, Iraq, and Afghanistan, a few bad apples tarnish the reputation of the U.S., but the doctrine of our basic goodness prevails. In a very underreported revelation, recently released documents from the Nixon White House unambiguously make clear that an order for genocide came directly from the Oval Office. Nixon tells Kissinger, "I want them to hit everything in Cambodia." Kissinger, ever the faithful servant, immediately conveyed the message to the Pentagon. A massive bombing campaign in Cambodia. Anything that flies on anything that moves. Rarely in history has a direct order for mass murder been discovered and published. The reaction from the political elites, the punditocracy, and the media? Undetectable. Noam Chomsky, internationally renowned MIT professor, practically invented modern linguistics. In addition to his pioneering work in that field, he's been a leading voice for peace and social justice. He's in such demand as a public speaker that he is booked years in advance. And wherever he appears, he draws huge audiences. The New Statesman calls him the conscience of the American people. He's the author of scores of books. His latest is the bestseller, Hegemony or Survival. I talked with Noam Chomsky in his office at MIT. Well, let's start with some memories. There's a new documentary film out called The Fog of War about Robert McNamara. And in it, he makes a rather interesting admission. He had been working with General Curtis LeMay, with whom he served in the period of the firebombing of Japanese cities in World War II. And he quoted LeMay telling him that if we'd lost the war, we'd all been prosecuted as war criminals. And then McNamara added, and I think he's right. And then he asks, but what makes it immoral if you lose and not immoral if you win?
Actually, I haven't seen the film, but what I've been told about it and read about it is that in the film, for the first time, McNamara identifies his own role during the Second World War in his biographical in the biographical material about him. He's been described as a kind of a statistician who was working somewhere in the background. But apparently, correct me if I'm wrong, but it turns out in the film that he was actually in a planning status, trying to decide where you could maximize Japanese civilian deaths with minimal cost. And Tokyo was selected because it was recognized that it's very densely populated. It's mostly wooden city, so you could set up a firestorm, which would be able to kill maybe 100,000 people with no problem. At that point, Japan had no air defenses, so it was just the question of how you could kill most civilians with least effort. And I understand that McNamara takes responsibility, can't say credit exactly, for having made this decision. His comment about the war criminals is not only true, but truism. In fact, if you look back at the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, they were designed that way in principle. I mean, this is discussed by, for example, Telford Taylor, who was chief prosecutor at Nuremberg years ago. He points out, and if you look at the record, it's clear that they had to, these were all post facto criminal sentencing, that it was for crimes that were not on the books at the time, but had decided what's going to be a war crime, and they will charge people for what they called war crimes. And they had an operational definition of war crime. It's anything that they did and we didn't do. And it was very explicit. I mean, that's why, for example, the bombing of Tokyo was not considered, or the bombing of Dresden, or the bombing of urban civilian centers generally. The U.S. and British Air Force did much more of it than the Germans. They aimed mainly at working class, poor areas, civilian areas, and it was devastating. But since the Allies did it much more than the Axis, it was removed from the category of war crimes. And that even showed up in individual testimonies. A German admiral, I think it was Dennett, the submarine commander, brought as a defense witness with an American submarine commander, Nimitz, who testified that Americans had done the things that he was charged with, and he was exonerated. So the principle was, it's a crime that you committed and we didn't. So therefore, McNamara's comment is certainly accurate, but in fact a truism, and it's been known for a long time. In fact, this is the Nuremberg Tribunal, which at least was semi-respectable. The Tokyo Tribunal was simply a farce. And some of the other trials of the Japanese were just unbelievable, like the trial of General Yamashita, who was charged, I think he was hanged for crimes that were committed by soldiers in the Philippines, Japanese soldiers who were technically under his command, but at the end of the war, at a period when there was absolutely no communication, they were isolated, cut off, he had no communication with them, and they did commit terrible atrocities, and he was hanged for it. Well, just imagine if that were generalized to commanders whose soldiers on their own, without any communication, committed crimes. I mean, the whole military command of every functioning army in the world would be hanged, plus the civilian leadership who are mostly responsible for it. It's not the generals. It's the civilians who are usually authorizing and organizing the worst crimes. So McNamara's statement is accurate, familiar, truism, and an understatement. The same is true of the trials that are going on right now. You recall what happened when it looked for about 30 seconds as though the Yugoslav tribunal, the special tribunal for Yugoslavia, might investigate NATO crimes. There were briefs brought to it from Western Canadian, British lawyers urging that they look into NATO war crimes, which of course existed. And for a brief moment, it looked as if they might. They were warned pretty quickly that they'd better not. The State Department spokesman said, look, we're funding this. This is not the kind of thing you do. Crimes are something that others do, not that we do. And that's true right down the line. I mean, take something timely. The famous Bush Doctrine. It has two components. One component is that we declare that we have the right to carry out offensive military actions against countries that we regard as a security threat because they have weapons of mass destruction. Well, the commentary on that was interesting. I mean, many of the foreign policy, that's half the doctrine. I'll get to the second half. The commentary was critical. So Foreign Affairs immediately had a critical article on what they called the new Imperial grand strategy. Many others criticized it. Not so much because they disagreed, but because they thought the implementation was extremely, the brazenness and the manner of implementation was ultimately a threat to the United States, and therefore shouldn't be done that way. Actually, Madeleine Albright, in an article in Foreign Affairs, pointed out quite accurately that this is not the kind of thing you do. Of course, every president has that doctrine, but you don't advertise it. You keep it in your pocket, and you use it when you want to. So this is just kind of stupid and dangerous. The most interesting comment, perhaps, was Kissinger's. Actually, it was before the doctrine was actually announced. It was obvious what it was going to be. He described it as a revolutionary new doctrine in international affairs, which, of course, tears to shreds the UN Charter and international law, but also eliminates the whole Westphalian system from the 17th century. So it's really revolutionary, but a good doctrine, although he also criticized the implementation. But he added, he said, we have to understand that it is not in the national interest for this doctrine to be universalized. Nice way of saying that the doctrine is for us, not for anyone else. So we will use force whenever we like against anyone we regard as a potential threat, and maybe we'll delegate that to clients, that right, but it's not for others. So that's the same point. Let's turn to the other doctrine. The other part of the Bush doctrine is that states that harbor terrorists are as guilty as the terrorists themselves, and will be treated as such. They have a right. We'll have, just as we have the right to attack and destroy terrorists, we have a right to attack and destroy states that harbor terrorists. Well, let's take a look at that doctrine. How does that one work? What are the states that harbor terrorists? Let's put aside harboring leaders of states. I mean, if we count that, reduces to absurdity in no time. So let's talk about the kind of terrorists that they are regard as terrorists. Orlando Bosch, for example, who the FBI accuses of 30 serious terrorist acts, some of them on U.S. soil. That includes participation in the destruction of the Cubana airliner in which 73 people were killed. The Justice Department wanted him deported. They said he's a threat to the security of the United States. George Bush #1, at the request of his son, governor of Florida, gave him presidential pardon. So he's sitting happily in Miami, and we're harboring a person who the Justice Department regards as a dangerous terrorist threat to the security of the United States. Or take, say, Emmanuel Constant. We don't have to go through that case. I mean, heavy responsibility for killing maybe 4,000 or 5,000 Haitians. It's part of the background for what's happening now. Living happily in Queens because the U.S. refuses even to respond to requests to extradition. Well, with that going on, who's harboring terrorists? I mean, if the most important revolutionary part of the Bush doctrine is that states that harbor terrorists are terrorist states, what do we conclude from that? Well, we conclude exactly what Kissinger was kind enough to say. These doctrines are unilateral. They are not intended as doctrines of international law or doctrines of international affairs. They are doctrines which grant the United States the right to use force and violence and to harbor terrorists and so on, but not anyone else. Pretty much as Kissinger stated. And now back to McNamara. Yes, he's simply saying, yeah, of course, and this goes back to World War II, to the trials. And in fact, there wasn't much relevant international law prior to that, but to the extent there was, that's always true. Crimes for the powerful, crimes are those that others commit. We don't have to run through the record, but it's close to universal.
Yeah. Orwell, whose centenary was marked last year, 2003, once remarked that the nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but he has a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. Let's talk a little bit more about Nuremberg. I've been looking actually at Telford Taylor's book. He was a chief prosecutor, and he said the charge of aggressive war was the core of the entire case at Nuremberg. And Robert Jackson, a Supreme Court justice, a very distinguished jurist, was the chief American prosecutor. And he talked about crimes against the peace of the world. To start, and wage an aggressive war has the moral qualities of the worst of crimes. Then the British prosecutor, his counterpart, Hartley Shawcross, spoke of the Germans that they had committed crime against peace, which consists of waging wars of aggression and in violation of treaties. All of this was later encoded in the UN Charter, where under international law, the planning and waging of aggressive war is regarded as a major war crime. Now, one has to ask, given the U.S. attack on Iraq, a country that was not threatening it, why has there not been any discussion about this, number one, and why aren't people talking about impeachment?
Well, they are. In fact, there are, again, various lawyers groups, to some extent in the United States, but mostly in England and Canada and others, are bringing demands for war crimes trials for the crime of aggression. We should point out, however, that the invasion of Iraq was plainly an act of aggression. It doesn't break any records. What was the invasion of South Vietnam, for example, in 1962, when Kennedy sent the Air Force to attack South Vietnam and started chemical warfare, which had devastating consequences, began driving the population into concentration camps and so on. I mean, that's aggression. You could say it's not aggression against a state that was a member of the United Nations, if that matters, but it was certainly aggression. Or what was the Indonesian invasion of East Timor? Obviously aggression. What was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which ended up killing 20,000 people? Both of these were carried out thanks to decisive U.S. Diplomatic, military, and economic support. In the case of East Timor, Britain, too. And we can go on. The invasion of Panama, for example, what was that? I mean, it's kind of a minor act in U.S. history in the region, but it was an invasion aimed at kidnapping a thug, not a thug of Saddam Hussein's ranking, but a serious one, who, in the course of the invasion, the U.S. killed, according to the Panamanians, 3,000 civilians. Maybe they're right. We don't investigate our own crimes, so nobody knows. But certainly killed plenty of people on the scale of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. It's roughly the same casualties, plus or minus. They kidnapped him in the Vatican embassy. The U.S. had to veto Security Council resolutions, vote against General Assembly resolutions, the usual business. He was brought back to Florida, all hopelessly illegal, tried in a ridiculous trial in which he was convicted of crimes which he had indeed committed, almost all of them, when he was on the CIA payroll. So it'll be just like the trial of Saddam Hussein. He'll be convicted of crimes that the U.S. supported. But that part won't be mentioned. So that's aggression, and we can go on and on. The case of Iraq was a bit unusual, partly for a lot of reasons. For one reason, because it was over such overwhelming international opposition. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a case where global opinion was so overwhelmingly against the action. Actually, that was most strikingly true in the countries where the governments agreed to go along, like Spain and Italy, where the population was even more opposed than it was in France and Germany. It was taken under every act that's taken by any state, just about, is under the pretext of defense. I mean, you can hardly find an exception to that. Hitler, Stalin, Japanese fascists, they're all defending themselves. So this was also under the pretext of self-defense, under the doctrine that Kissinger describes as revolutionary, namely, we have the right to use force to defend ourselves against potential enemies. Again, if that doctrine was universalized, everything goes out the window. Well, how do the international law community deal with this? That's quite interesting. In fact, if you have the time, I'd suggest reading journals like the professional journals, the Journal of the American Society of International Law. When something like this takes place, the international law professionals have a complicated task. Some of them, there's a fringe who just say the truth. Look, it's a violation of international law. But most have to construct complex arguments to justify it as defense counsels. And that's basically the job, defense counsels for state power. And the justifications are kind of interesting. They range from people who are pretty honest, like Michael Glennon at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, who simply says, look, international law and the UN Charter are a lot of hot air. It's time to get rid of them. They're not worth keeping because they impose, he says, yes, of course this is in violation of those laws, but they're ridiculous. They're not worth keeping because they restrict the ability of the United States to use force. And that suffices to show that they are hot air and must be eliminated. Furthermore, he says, law, this is a standard principle of law. Law is a living doctrine. Its meaning depends on practice as well as words and so on. It's an evolving, living doctrine. That's called legal positivism, big theory, and it has some sense to it. But again, that's very refined. So in this case, his argument, and many people, Ruth Wedgwood, other defenders of the U.S. action, argue that, well, the U.S. has been carrying out actions like this for some time, bombing of Serbia and so on, and that has changed the nature of law, because law is a living doctrine. Is a living system of principles. When it's changed by international practice, it's modified. I mean, was it modified by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iraq, of Kuwait? No. Was it modified by Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia? One of the few actions in modern history that might be called a humanitarian intervention. Very hard to find others that were, but this pretty clearly was, and he got rid of Pol Pot at the peak of his atrocities. That was bitterly condemned. The U.S. supported an invasion of Vietnam to punish them, embargoes and so on. So that didn't change. That didn't create new norms of international law. Or India's invasion of East Pakistan, Bangladesh, which put an end to huge atrocities. That didn't change anything. Also condemned. We're back to the unilateralism. The positivist doctrine, the profound doctrine that law is a living instrument and changes with practice, refers to the practice of the super powerful and the super violent. They're the ones who change the law, not anybody else. So we're back to McNamara. It's unilateral. Some of the justifications are kind of interesting interesting to look at for a philosophy seminar. So the current issue of the professional journal, American Society of International Law, has a complex, thoughtful article, quoting Habermas and all sorts of big thinkers. And the argument comes down to this. It says, when the UN invaded Iraq, it actually was abiding by the UN Charter.
When the U.S. invaded Iraq.
When the U.S. invaded Iraq, it was abiding by the UN Charter, because we have to recognize that there's two interpretations of the Charter. There's the kind of literal interpretation, which is for small minds, which says that the use of force in international affairs is criminal, except under circumstances which don't apply, but that's kind of trivial and uninteresting. But then there's the communitarian interpretation of the Charter, which says that an act is legitimate if it's carrying out the will of the community of nations. Then goes on to say, well, the Security Council doesn't have the military force to carry out the will of the community of nations, so therefore it implicitly delegates this to states that do have the force, meaning the United States, and therefore the United States, by invading Iraq, under the communitarian interpretation of the Charter, was actually fulfilling the will of the international community. I mean, it's irrelevant that, 90% of the population in almost all states bitterly condemned it, that they just don't understand their own will, but their actual will was expressed in Security Council resolutions that Iraq didn't fully comply with, and so on. So therefore, the U.S. was, in fact, using force with the authorization of the Security Council, even though the Security Council denied it, under the subtle and complex communitarian interpretation. This is the way this is a large part of the academic profession, to be serious, making up complex, subtle arguments which are childishly ridiculous, but are enveloped in sufficient profundity and footnotes and references to allegedly deep thinkers, so that you can construct a framework which has, in some strange universe, a kind of plausibility. But it comes down to what McNamara said, very straight. When they do it, it's a crime. When we do it, it's not. And more generally, it's the defeated who are tried, not the victors. All of these trials, every one of them, almost without exception, is victor's justice. Sometimes they're legitimate, but that's kind of incidental. The basic principle is that the losers have to confess, not the victors. They're free.
The current rhetoric around Iraq is that the country was, quote, liberated. Now, my understanding of that term is when another country invades a country and occupies it, and then an outside force then comes in and liberates it. The classic example is always given is France was invaded in 1940, and it was liberated.
Yeah. Actually, if you had bothered to check with the French population then, they were quite split on that. So many supported the Nazis. That was true of every occupied country in Europe. But I think it's fair to say France was liberated. In this case, if you want to know whether a country was liberated, you ask the population. I mean, they're the ones who decide, not intellectuals and politicians in the invading country. Well, there are Western-run polls in Iraq. So, I presume they're not, it's not run by Al Jazeera. It's run by the State Department and other Western organizations, Gallup, Oxford Research Institute. One of the questions they ask people in Iraq is it an occupying force or a liberating force? And by about 5 to 1, they say it's an occupying force. About 80% say they don't trust the military. One of the most remarkable poll results that I saw was people were asked, "Who's your favorite? What foreign leader, foreign head of state, has the most favorable? Do you have the most favorable opinion of?" Jacques Chirac, who was president of France, who was the symbol of opposition to the war, far above Bush. The pathetic Blair was trailing even farther behind. In fact, some of the polls, to my utter astonishment, a substantial majority says the U.S. forces should leave. Now, I find that pretty hard to believe, because the invasion created such a situation of chaos and destruction. But 95% in the same polls say their greatest concern is just security. And if the occupying army were to leave, it would get much worse at this point. Nevertheless, in at least some of the polls, the majority is calling for them to leave.
You're listening to Noam Chomsky on War Crimes and Imperial Fantasies, Part 1. This is Alternative Radio. You can order copies of this program by calling the following toll-free number, 1-800-444-1977. Or you can go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Stay tuned at the end for complete details on ordering.
There's still more revealing ones. The President Bush, back in November, gave a speech in which he declared that we're setting out on a new course of nobility and magnificence. We're going to bring democracy to Iraq and to the Middle East and to the world and to Mars and so on and so forth. The speech was greeted with the usual reverential awe in the United States. David Ignatius in the Washington Post, maybe it was the extreme. He said, that shows that the Iraq invasion was he didn't use invasion, but the Iraq war was the most noble act of war in human history. The grand visionary Paul Wolfowitz, whose heart bleeds for the suffering of poor Arabs, is the one who's in charge in bringing democracy, and on and on. I mean, there were critics, but the critics, as far as I know, invariably took for granted the authenticity of the claim. All the criticism I could find said, yeah, it's true, Bush is trying to bring a democracy to Iraq, but it's beyond our means, or it's overambitious, or they're not ready for it, or something like that. I was unable, maybe you could, I couldn't find one comment, one word in the mainstream press and commentary in journals that even questioned the validity of the claim. That's kind of remarkable, because everyone claims to be doing that. I mean, Stalin, for example, was passionately declaring his wish to save the democracies of Eastern Europe from the fascist threat and so on. Do we take it seriously? No, you never take pronouncements of heads of state seriously. But in this case, reverential awe is an absolute requirement. You can't even question it. So the critics accept it and then criticize it as overreaching. Just like the war in Vietnam was defense of South Vietnam. You can say, we made a mistake or this or that, but you can't question it. Well, here too. I was able to find only one exception to this, incidentally, in the Washington Post. About a week after the president's speech, they did report that there are people who don't believe it, Iraqis. They reported a poll, and it wasn't connected to the speech, but a separate article. But if you look at it, what it said, Iraqis were asked in a Western poll, why do you think the U.S. Entered Iraq? They didn't say invade. And there were some who agreed with Bush and 100% of Western commentators. 1% said that the goal was to establish democracy. 70% said that the goal was to take over Iraq's resources and to reorganize the Middle East. I mean, they agreed with Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz and so on to reorganize the Middle East in the interests of the United States and Israel. That was the overwhelmingly dominant position. Actually, if you look at the poll results, they show a much more sophisticated understanding of the West. It's very common for the victims to understand a system better than the guys who hold the stick. You want to learn about patriarchal families. You don't ask the father, you ask the mother. Then maybe you'll learn something. Here, too, they had a sophisticated response. 1% said the U.S. intends to establish democracy. 50%, approximately, said the U.S. wants democracy, but will not permit the democratic Iraqi government to carry out its own policies without U.S. influence. In other words, they understand that the U.S. wants democracy as long as the U.S. can control it. And that's correct. Bush's call for enhancing democracy just repeats what Reagan said 20 years earlier. Our goal is enhancing democracy, primarily in Central America. And from the U.S. point of view, democracies were established by violence, and democracies which, as their own scholars concede, had to be, quoting, top-down democratic systems in which traditional elites linked to U.S. power remain in control. That's a democracy. In other words, a democracy is a system in which you're free to do whatever you like as long as it's what we tell you. Now that ought to be taught in elementary schools here. I mean, the evidence for that is so overwhelming that it's boring to repeat it. But American commentators cannot understand it. On the other hand, Iraqis seem to understand it, and not because they know the history of Central America, but because they know their own history. I mean, the British carved out Iraq in 1920 artificially. They set the borders so that Britain would get control of the oil in the north, not Turkey, and that Iraq would be a dependent. And they ensured that it'd be a dependency by cutting off access to the sea. That's the point of the British colony of Kuwait, and it was a free country. I mean, they declared it to be a free, independent country, you know, running its own affairs and so on and so forth, until you look at the British colonial office records, secret, but now public, in which they say, yeah, Iraq will be a free country. It'll be an Arab facade, like the other countries of the region, where the British will rule behind various colonial constitutional fictions. Well, you know, Iraqis don't have to read the secret records. They have their own history. They know how free they were. And furthermore, they can open their eyes right now. I mean, it's kind of striking to see the U.S. press and commentators try to evade the fact that while we're dedicated passionately to democracy, the U.S. is also desperately trying to evade an election that the Iraqis are calling for. So we want democracy, but not elections, because elections we won't be able to control. So there has to be some complicated system where we can manage to control it. I mean, this is pretty hard to miss. You know, like the London Financial Times, not a particularly radical journal. Its editorial points out, look, choice is straight. Is Iraq going to be run by Iraqis elected by Iraqis, or is it going to be run by Iraqis who will have nominal sovereignty within a system constructed by the occupiers? Yeah, that's exactly right. They can see that. They don't have to read the Washington Post to discover that the U.S. is constructing the biggest embassy in the world right in Baghdad, or that the U.S. is insisting on some kind of status of forces agreement in which the sovereign government will grant the U.S. the right to keep as many military forces and bases as it wants there forever. And they don't have to read the business press in the United States to discover that the occupying authorities have imposed an economic regime of a kind that no sovereign state would accept for a moment, which opens up Iraq totally to takeover by foreign corporations. The only thing they left out is the oil, because that would have been too blatant. But that'll work too. You know, you read between the lines, you see Halliburton executives explaining that the work we're doing now on nice taxpayer subsidies will put us in a good position to, you know, manage and control the oil resources. So they know all of this. They also know that the economic system that was imposed on them is a, you know, Bush administration dream, with a maximum of highest tax rate is 15%, so basically no taxes, no constraints on foreign investment, so hence full foreign takeover. Iraqi businessmen are screaming about it because they know they'll never be able to compete. In fact, it's almost exactly the same program that the U.S. imposes when it has total control. And Iraqis don't have to study economic history to know it. You know, it's their lives. So they can see the extent to which the U.S. is bringing democracy and exactly how. And therefore, 1% of them agree with 100% of sophisticated Western commentators. Well, you know, that fact ought to interest us. It's public. I mean, I read it in the Washington Post. It's not exactly a secret document. See if you can find a comment on it. I mean, how come 100% of us take the president's pronouncements with reverential awe, and 1% of Iraqis do? Does that suggest something?
Well, I think that awe and reverence is showing signs of withering now. You don't think so?
No. The withering is... the withering does not question the assumption. It says, yeah, that's what you're trying to do, but you're doing it badly. I mean, it's like, let's go back to McNamara. McNamara was, when he sort of came out with his apologetics, the apologia, the book and the film, was highly praised by doves, humanist doves. They said, okay, we're vindicated. He finally came around and agreed we were right all along. What did he say? He said he apologized to the American people because he didn't tell them soon enough that the war was going to be costly for Americans, and he's really sorry about this. He deserves punishment. It's a horrible crime. Did he apologize to the Vietnamese? There's not a word in there of apology to the Vietnamese. Okay, we killed a couple of million of them. We destroyed the country. They're still dying from the chemical warfare that I initiated. None of those. The premises are accepted across the board. We were trying to defend South Vietnam, maybe noble, maybe not noble, but it was costly to us, so we had to stop. And within that framework, you can have criticism. Same now. Bush didn't tell us the truth about weapons of mass destruction. Suppose he had told us the truth. Would it change anything? Or suppose he had found them. Would that change anything? I mean, you want to find weapons of mass destruction, you can find them all over the place. Take, say, Israel. So if you want to worry about countries with weapons of mass destruction, easy to find them. In fact, we don't have to look very far. Right here. The U.S. is increasing proliferation itself by rejecting treaties, by barring any effort to stop militarization of space, as it did again at the UN last December, the General Assembly, by developing new nuclear weapons, small, what they call small, which means massive destructive nuclear weapons, of course encouraging others to do so. More money's now going into so-called missile defense in the new budget. Everyone interprets that as an offensive weapon, whether it's U.S. analysts or Chinese analysts. It's an offensive weapon which is supposed to provide protection against retaliation to a first strike. And everyone knows, the intelligence agencies are happy to tell you how other countries respond, say China, namely by increasing their offensive military capacities. The other mode of response is terror. Those are the weapons available to potential targets. So we're asking for an increase in terror, increase in proliferation, increase in threat to us. That is the exact meaning of these programs. And it's not particularly secret. Why do it? Well, for short-term gain. I mean, if it leads to long-term disaster, it's somebody else's department. And the same is true in other domains. I mean, the concern over global warming has now reached a stage where even the Pentagon is producing studies about the severe threat. Not very long range, maybe 20 or 30 years. Nobody knows exactly what, but among the predictions taken seriously is that there could be a fairly sudden shift in the Gulf Stream, which would turn Northern Europe into Labrador and Greenland. It might turn large parts of the United States into a desert. It would wipe out places like many other parts of the world. I mean, rising sea level is probably going to wipe out Bangladesh and kill who knows how many people. The most arable lands in Pakistan may become like the Sahara. The effects of all of this in not a very long time are indescribable. Are we doing anything about it? No. We don't care. We, meaning planners, don't care. It's not part of their framework. Just as it's basically part of the ideology, the fanatic ideology of the corporate system from which they come. You're a corporate manager. You don't care about what's going to happen 10 years from now. You have to make sure you get your big bonus and stock options next year, not 10 years from now. That's somebody else's department. This is built into the institutional structure. You can't even blame individuals for it, any more than you can blame McNamara for doing a cost-benefit analysis that shows how to maximize the number of Japanese civilians you can murder. It's like Hannah Arendt said about Eichmann. It's just part of the institutional structure. You fit into it, you do your job, other considerations aren't part of your domain. And going back to the beginning, this is based on a framework of assumptions, among them that we have unilateral rights to do whatever we want. Shows up in war crimes trial, shows up in the revolutionary new doctrines of aggression at will, or harboring terrorists. In fact, everywhere you look.
Just a couple of quick questions about this issue of they don't care. They have short-range vision. I mean, they have children. They have grandchildren. I mean, are they totally dismissing their futures? And why would the elites, who are not being threatened in the United States, their power is not being challenged at this moment, why would they risk their very survival in pursuing these new developments as you've just described them?
Well, we can ask why, but if we want to look into it, we should recognize that, again, it's close to a historical universal. That's common. I mean, when Hitler started a two-front war, there was a very strong chance that Germany would be destroyed. Did it stop him from starting a two-front war? No. I mean, calculation is, well, maybe we'll get away with it, in which case, I'll be the greatest leader in German history, and so on and so forth. Or let's just take our own recent history. Go back to 1950. Around 1950, the U.S. had a position of security that's unparalleled in human history. I mean, controlled the hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans. There wasn't a threat within shouting distance except for one. There was a potential threat. The potential threat was intercontinental ballistic missiles with thermonuclear warheads. They weren't yet available, but they were beginning to be developed. And that would be a threat to the U.S. heartland, could destroy it, in fact. Well, if you care about your children and your grandchildren, you would do something to prevent that threat from developing. Could it have been done? Well, it wasn't tried, so we don't know. But it would at least have been possible to explore treaties which would have blocked the development of these weapons. In fact, it's not unlikely that the Russians would have agreed. They were so far behind and legitimately frightened and threatened that they might well have agreed to not developing these weapons. They also understood that the U.S. was trying to spend them into economic destruction. They understood that perfectly well. We know it from the released Russian archives. They understood that the U.S. economy, which is, of course, much larger, was trying to compel them to enter into an arms race that they couldn't survive. So it's possible, in fact likely, that they would have accepted it. Well, what's the historical record on this? Well, there's a standard magisterial history of all of this by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor, who had access to declassified records and so on. And he mentions, more or less in passing, that he was unable to find any mention of even the possibility of pursuing this option. It's not that it was suggested and rejected. So it wasn't mentioned. Did you have to be some kind of a genius to understand in the early 50s that that's the one potential threat to the United States and that it might destroy your grandchildren? No, you didn't have to be a genius. You had to have the normal intelligence of knowledge of the world of a normal high school student. But these are not stupid people. Atchison, Nitze, Kenna, and the rest are not stupid people. But it didn't occur to them, because it doesn't occur to you that you might try to save a world in which your children and grandchildren can survive when you have higher aims, like maximizing short-term power and privilege.
One final question, I promise. Someone is reading this interview or listening to it and saying, wow, Chomsky's got a lot on the ball. MIT professor, got this command of information and facts and history. What do I make of it? What do I do as an individual?
First thing you ought to do is verify it. Just because I say it doesn't make it true. So the first thing you ought to do, if you find it interesting, is ask if it's true. Well, there are ways to do that. You can check it up. I mean, I'm sure if you look closely at this transcript, you'll find things in it which weren't quite accurate. I mean, that's almost inevitable in an informal discussion. You don't have all the minor details, right? So check it out, see what looks correct, what looks wrong, look at other material which wasn't discussed, figure out what the truth really is. That's what you got a brain for. If you think that the general thrust of it is correct, we have no problem in doing something about it. We're not facing, we're not going to be thrown into a prison and face torture. We're not going to get assassinated. We have enormous privilege. We have tremendous freedom. Means endless opportunities. I mean, I should tell you that every night I get many letters, and after every talk I get many questions from people who say, well, what can I do? I want to change things. What can I do? I never hear these questions from peasants in southern Colombia or Turks and Kurds in southeastern Turkey who are under miserable repression, or anybody who's suffering. They don't ask what they can do. They tell you what they're doing. Somehow the fact of enormous privilege and freedom carries with it a sense of impotence, which is a strange but striking phenomenon. And we're thinking about. Fact is, we can do anything, just about anything. No difficulty wherever you are in finding groups that are working hard on things that concern you, joining them, and so on. But that's not the kind of answer that people want. The answer that they want, I think, in the back of their minds is, what can I do that will be quick and easy and bring about an end to these problems? Like, Columbia students who I used to argue with back in 1968, who literally thought, look, we're sitting in the president's office for a couple of weeks. After that, it's all going to be peace and love. Or I went to a demonstration, same as it was before. 15 million people marched in the streets on February 15th. The war went on. It's hopeless. Well, that's not the way things work. You want to make changes in the world, you're going to have to be there day after day, doing the boring, straightforward work of getting a couple of people interested and building a slightly bigger organization and carrying out the next move and suffering frustration and finally getting somewhere. That's how the world changes. That's how you get rid of slavery. That's how you get women's rights. That's how you get votes. That's how you get protection for working people on the job. Everything you can point to has been gotten that way, not by going to one demonstration and it didn't work, so I'll go home, or tell me who I should vote for and then I'll go away. I mean, elections are a perfectly good example. I mean, it's okay to get a better or maybe less worse candidate in, but that's the beginning, not the end. If you end there, you might as well not have voted. I mean, unless you develop the ongoing live democratic culture, which is going to compel those candidates to do the things that you voted for, they're not going to do it. Pushing a button and then going home and, watching the Super Bowl, that's not going to do it.
Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, thanks.
To place a credit card order for the complete two-part program, Noam Chomsky on War Crimes and Imperial Fantasies, call us toll-free at 1-800-444-1977. Again, that toll-free number is 1-800-444-1977. Or you can go to our website. This edition of AR features Noam Chomsky on War Crimes and Imperial Fantasies, Part 2. Studs Terkel, the great historian and radio journalist, says the U.S. suffers from a kind of national Alzheimer's disease. Aided and abetted by the media and the education system, there are aspects of history that are simply forgotten. Take, say, the Nuremberg trials after World War II, where the top Nazis faced justice. What were they accused of? Attacking another country without cause. The judges spoke as one when they declared, "To initiate a war of aggression is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole." Many legal scholars say the judgment at Nuremberg could apply to the U.S. attack on Iraq. Noam Chomsky, internationally renowned MIT professor, practically invented modern linguistics. In addition to his pioneering work in that field, he has been a leading voice for peace and social justice. He ranks with Marx, Shakespeare, and the Bible as one of the 10 most quoted sources. The New Statesman calls him the conscience of the American people. He's the author of scores of books. His latest is the bestseller, Hegemony or Survival. I talked with Noam Chomsky in his office at MIT. I want to ask you actually about a painting that hangs in your office. It's rather gruesome. And you've commented to me that mostly U.S. citizens don't seem to know who it is, but most foreigners that come to visit you and see it recognize it immediately. Can you talk about it?
It's not exactly accurate. Just about everyone from south of the Rio Grande knows what it is. Almost no one from north of the Rio Grande does. Among Europeans, it's maybe 10%. I haven't tried Asians, probably not. It's actually quite apropos. It's about the Reagan presidency, and starting slightly before. It's a picture given to me by a Jesuit priest of, as you can see, the angel of death standing over Archbishop Romero, who was assassinated in 1980, so that's on Carter's watch. He was assassinated a few days after he had written a letter to President Carter pleading with him not to send aid to the military junta in El Salvador, which will be used to crush people struggling for their elementary human rights. The aid went. He was assassinated, then Reagan took over, and the kindest thing you can say about Reagan is he may not have known what the policies of administration were, but I'll pretend he did. So the Reagan years were years of devastation and disaster in El Salvador. Maybe 70,000 people were slaughtered. The decade began with the assassination of the Archbishop. It ended rather symbolically with the brutal murder of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, by an elite battalion, trained, armed, run by the United States, which has already had a huge bloody trail of murders and massacres behind it. Those priests are also shown in the picture, along with their housekeeper and daughter, who were also murdered by the same elite battalion, and in between, tens of thousands of the usual victims. That was El Salvador. As I say, people south of the border know what it is. People north of the border haven't a clue. Europeans, some know. Just imagine that something comparable had happened, say, in Czechoslovakia, that the decade of the 80s had opened with the a murder of an archbishop by forces closely tied to the Russians, an archbishop who was called a voice for the voiceless. Then his successor denounced the Russian government for supporting a war of extermination and genocide against a defenseless civilian population, which is what happened in El Salvador. Then went on with the war of extermination and assassination, and the decade ended with the blowing out of the brains of Václav Havel and half a dozen of his associates. And that was, meanwhile, 70,000 other Czechs. Would we know about it? Well, chances are we wouldn't, because it probably would have led to a nuclear war and there'd be nobody around to know anything. But assuming we survived, yeah, we'd know about it. And that's a striking difference. And it illustrates something quite general. When enemies commit crimes, they're crimes. In fact, we're allowed to expand them, lie about them, make up stories about them and so on, but surely to get angry and infuriated about them. When we commit crimes, they didn't happen. And that's, you see that very strikingly in the Reagan worship that has been created as a cult through the 1990s by a massive propaganda campaign. So take a look at what's happening now. No mention of this. Of course, in the Latin American press, they mention it. In fact, the Salvadoran press condemned Reagan rather sharply. In Nicaragua, even the right-wing pro-Contra press that was supported and funded by the United States condemned Reagan, which is pretty shocking. And of course throughout the continent the same, because his regime was one of murder and brutality and violence, which probably left a couple 100,000 people dead, hundreds of thousands of orphans and widows, devastated the countries. But this can't be mentioned here because it didn't happen. So for example, there was one well-known specialist in international law, actually one of the historians of the World Court, did write a letter. He sent me a copy of it, a short letter to the New York Times after their rapturous editorial, in which he said they'd omitted to point out that Reagan was the only world figure who had rejected world court orders. In this case, court orders to terminate an international terrorist campaign against Nicaragua, which of course the U.S. disregarded. It also vetoed two Security Council resolutions affirming it, and immediately went on to escalate the war for the first time officially authorizing attacks on what the Southern Command called soft targets, undefended civilian targets, ended up killing, well, just to quote Reaganite historians, regard themselves as neo-Reaganites, accurately pointing out that in per capita terms, the death toll in Nicaragua would have been roughly 2.5 million in the United States, higher than the total number of deaths in all American wars of the 20th century and the 19th century, including the Civil War. But it doesn't exist. You can't, of course the letter wasn't published, but there's also no reference to it, and it doesn't matter. And I guess much worse than that. The person responsible for the war on the ground was the person who was called the proconsul of Honduras. Honduras was the base for the terrorist army attacking Nicaragua. The proconsul was John Negroponte, whose main task had two tasks as proconsul. First was to lie to Congress about atrocities carried out by the Honduran security services so that the military aid could continue to flow to Honduras, not because Honduras is of any significance, because it was the base for attacking Nicaragua. And second, to supervise the training camps where the mercenary army was being trained, armed, and organized to carry out the atrocities, the terrorist war for which it was condemned by the World Court and the Security Council, absent the veto. He's now the proconsul of Iraq. In fact, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, had an article headed Modern Proconsul, pointing out that Negroponte is going to Iraq as a modern proconsul, and that he learned his trade in Honduras in the early 80s. They didn't go into it, but that's accurate. In Honduras, I might add, he was in charge of the biggest CIA station in the world. He's now in charge of the biggest embassy in the world in Iraq. And all of this didn't happen, and doesn't matter, because we did it. And that's a sufficient reason for effacing it from history.
In between his Negroponte service in Honduras and his appointment as ambassador to Iraq, he was Colin Powell's deputy on the National Security Council, and then he was appointed by Bush II as U.S. ambassador to the UN. What you're saying kind of reminds me of an Orwell quote from 1984. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased. The erasure was forgotten. The lie became the truth. We're sitting here on Friday, June 11th, looking at the front page of the New York Times, and it's full of the solemnity and pageantry of a state funeral honoring President Reagan, someone who proudly declared, I'm quoting, "I am a Contra." And then he went on to compare the Contras to the moral equivalent of the founding fathers. The New York Times, in its front page story, "Legacy of Reagan now begins the test of time." R.W. Apple Jr. writes, "What will history, with its privileged vantage point, far from the heat of partisan battles, conclude about him?"
Well, the only addition one should make to the Orwell quote is that nothing had to be effaced because it was effaced instantly. It didn't happen. I won't go into that, but it was all blocked at once. In R.W. Apple's column, which is typical, you can't pick him out except that he happens to be there, the entire record of Reaganite atrocities is completely effaced. For example, you mentioned that, correctly, that Negroponte went on to be Colin Powell's deputy. What was Colin Powell doing until the official moderate as national security advisor? Well, for one thing, let's take Africa, which he's supposed to be concerned with. During the Reagan years, 8 years, there was a policy called constructive engagement. During this period, by that time, there was very strong opposition to apartheid. Congress even passed legislation banning aid and support for South Africa. The Reaganites had to find devious ways to get around the congressional legislation in order to, in fact, increase their trade with South Africa. And the reason was that South Africa was defending itself against what was identified under during Powell's tenure in 1988 as one of the more notorious terrorist organizations in the world, namely Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. During those 8 years, U.S.-backed South Africa, British-backed as well, killed an estimated 1.5 million people just in the surrounding countries, Angola and Mozambique, putting aside what was going on in South Africa. That's in Reagan's years, and with Powell being a high official, in fact, at the end, National Security Council advisor, and Negroponte, his associate.
Well, Apple continues in his column talking about Reagan's, quote, extraordinary political gifts that carried him through his presidency, and his talents as a communicator, his intuitive understanding of the average American. One of the things that happened during Reagan's period was the invasion of Grenada. And I remember you were in Boulder on that day, October 25th, 1983, and you began your talk by saying the latest U.S. intervention as of this morning was Grenada, which Reagan called a Soviet-Cuban beachhead.
Again, the kindest thing you can say about Reagan is he probably didn't know what he was saying. He was handed his notes by his speechwriters, including his jokes, incidentally. But again, pretending that he knew. Yes, the claim was this was a Soviet-Cuban beachhead because an air base was being built by a couple of dozen Cuban contractors under British planning and authorization. And the claim was that the Russians were, if they could somehow find Grenada on a map, were going to use it as an air base to attack the United States. In a sense, Apple is right in saying that Reagan touched a chord in the population. There is, for whatever reason, it's been a very frightened and terrified country for a long time. There's an undercurrent of fear, and Reagan exhibited it He was an incredible coward. Somebody who could believe that an air base in Grenada could be used to attack the United States does not even reach the level of laughingstock. And it was the same with Nicaragua. Reagan declared a national emergency because the government of Nicaragua poses an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. Again, that doesn't even begin to approach the laugh test. He then explained, after all, they're only 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. Those hordes might come soon waving their copies of Mein Kampf, as George Shultz, as Secretary of State, put it. Reagan went on to say, even though we're facing this immense danger from Nicaragua, I'm going to be brave. I remember Winston Churchill, who said, no matter how great the odds, we have to keep on struggling. So like Churchill against Hitler, I'm going to defend this country against all odds, against the massive Nicaraguan hordes who are about to overwhelm us. Anyone looking at this wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry. In fact, you have to end up crying because, of course, it was a way of destroying the country, that country, and very seriously harming this one. But the streak of extreme cowardice does run through after the invasion, and of course the reason for it was not very obscure. There had just been a bombing in Lebanon where American Marines were murdered, and then they kind of had to cover this up with a grand gesture defending us from destruction by Grenada, and then again standing tall. This was typical of the what was going on through the Reagan years, and the idea that he struck a chord among the American people is simply not true. He was not a popular president. In fact, the press sometimes now even has to concede. Take a look at the Gallup polls. His poll ratings through his years were roughly average, below every one of his successors, except this one. By 1992, Reagan had become the most unpopular living ex-president. Apart from Nixon, he ranked slightly above Nixon in unpopularity. Then came the immense propaganda campaign, which has been going on for about 10 years, to try and turn him into a semi-divinity. And it's been played out quite successfully, and as you follow the propaganda campaign and you check the polls, you see that the reverence for the imperial leader has increased roughly as the propaganda campaign mounted. It's true, people are susceptible to imperial propaganda. This event today is intriguing. As the Times pointed out, it's following the script of a 300-page book which spells out in precise detail what happens every minute of the imperial ceremony. There has been nothing like it in American history. There's some reference made to the Kennedy assassination, but that's totally different. That's the assassination of a living president. Comparison to this, there's absolutely nothing until you go back to the outlandish George Washington cult that was cultivated in the early 19th century when Washington was turned into the perfect human being, the most amazing creature who ever walked the face of the earth, and on with what you might find in North Korea about Kim Il-sung. But from then until the Reagan propaganda, now, of course, with a very sophisticated and huge public relations industry and so on, there's just nothing comparable to it.
Well, someone who's described as the father of the public relations industry is Edward Bernays, and he wrote in the opening lines of his 1928 book, Propaganda, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country."
He was one of the early founders, gurus of the public relations industry. In fact, he's incidentally, we have to place him in the spectrum, he's way on the left. He was a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, and an active and honored one. So he's not talking from the right-wing extreme. He's expressing the liberal view, standard liberal view, that democracy is an extremely dangerous thing. We must prevent it. We can't, by Bernays' period, it was understood, both in Britain and the United States, that people have won too much freedom for the state to repress them by violence. And therefore, both in Britain and the United States, the two most democratic countries, there was a growth of major industries, public relation industry, to try to control attitudes and beliefs, since you can't control people by force. And Bernays was a leading figure. In fact, his first great achievement that sort of put him on, made a star out of him, was a public relations campaign trying to get women to smoke. So he had models walking down Fifth Avenue smoking cigarettes and showing how it makes you beautiful and slim and so on. And I can't estimate how many tens of millions of people he managed to kill by that, but substantial number. And that put him on the map. His next famous achievement was Guatemala. He took over at the request of the United Fruit Company public relations activities to try to lay the basis for the U.S.-backed invasion, which destroyed an experiment in Guatemalan democracy and opened up 40 years of extreme terror and violence, and he's greatly praised for that. But remember, all this is at the left liberal extreme of the spectrum. Bernays himself his background was in Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, which is the first official state propaganda agency in the United States. Its goal was to drive a relatively pacifist population into becoming hysterical anti-German fanatics, and it succeeded, and that success impressed a lot of people. Bernays took that success and mentions it in the same book, in fact, as the basis of his recognition that you can control and manipulate attitudes and in that way, in fact, undermine democracy, what he calls build democracy, but it means undermine it. The Dean of American Journalism, Walter Lippmann, came from the same commission, drew the same conclusions. The business world, of course, did. Adolf Hitler was much impressed by the commission and suggested, probably accurately, that the Germans lost the First World War because they could not match Anglo-American propaganda achievements, and he vowed that next time Germany would be ready, and so on. Had a big impact on future developments.
Your new building here at MIT is opposite, actually, a building that's curiously called the Center for Learning and Memory. One can only speculate as to what goes on there. But I'd like you to talk about memory and knowledge of history as a tool of resistance to propaganda.
Well, memory, it is well understood long before Orwell that memory must be repressed. Not only memory, but consciousness of what's happening in front of you must be repressed. Because if the public comes to understand what's being done in its name, it probably won't permit it. That's the main reason for propaganda. Otherwise, there's no point in it. And why not just tell the truth? It's easier to tell the truth than to lie. You don't get caught. I mean, you don't have to put in any effort and so on. But power systems never tell the truth if they can get away with it, because they simply don't trust the public. And this happens every minute. What we were talking about is an example. The appointment of Negroponte is a perfect example. And it goes on and on. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times published one of the most incredible sentences I have ever seen. They published the Nixon-Kissinger, a report about the Nixon-Kissinger interchanges. Kissinger fought very hard through the courts to try to prevent it, but the courts permitted it. And they had a short report about it. Well, you read through it, and you see the following statement embedded in it. Nixon at one point informs Kissinger, his local, his right hand, Eichmann, that he should call for a massive bombing campaign of Cambodia. And Kissinger transmits the order, in these words. He says, orders the Pentagon carry out a massive campaign of bombing campaign against Cambodia, anything that flies on anything that moves. I mean, that is the most explicit call for what we call genocide when other people do it that I've ever seen in the historical record. I mean, right now, right at this moment, there's prosecution of Milosevic going on, international tribunal, and the prosecutors are kind of hampered because they can't find direct orders or direct connection even, connecting Milosevic to any atrocities on the ground. Suppose they found a statement like this. Suppose a document came out from Milosevic saying, reduce Kosovo to rubble, anything that flies against anything that moves. I mean, they'd be overjoyed. Trial would be over. He'd be sent away for multiple life sentences if it was a U.S. trial, immediately to the electric chair. But they can't find any such document. In fact, nobody's even found a document like that connecting Hitler to the Holocaust. Scholars have been working on it for years. And I can't remember an example of such a direct order to carry out what amounted to a huge massacre. I mean, way beyond the level of anything we call genocide when other people do it. Was there any reaction? Did anybody notice it? Did anybody comment on it? Actually, I've brought it up in talks a number of times, and I've noticed not only is there, people don't understand, they understand it the minute I say it, but not 5 minutes later, because it's just too unacceptable. We cannot have be people who openly and publicly call for genocide and then carry it out. It can't be. So therefore it didn't happen. And therefore it doesn't even have to be wiped out of history because they'll never enter history any more than the World Court hearing did.
In an essay called On War Crimes from At War with Asia, that came out in 1970. You were quoting Bertrand Russell from the International War Crimes Tribunal, and Russell says, "It is in the nature of imperialism that citizens of the imperial power are always among the last to know or care about circumstances in the colonies."
Yeah, I disagree with them about care. I think they do care, and I think that's why they're the last to know. They're the last to know because of massive propaganda campaigns that keep them from knowing. Now, propaganda can be either, explicit or silence. Silence is a kind of propaganda. So when you're silent about your own crimes, that's propaganda too. And I think the reason for the propaganda of both kinds is that people do care. And if they find out, they're not going to let it happen. In fact, we actually see that right in front of us. You won't read it in the headlines. But take, say, the events in Fallujah. There was a Marine invasion of Fallujah. They killed, nobody knows how many people, hundreds, let's say, of people. We never investigate our own victims. Nobody does, so we don't know the numbers. But the U.S. had to back off, and they won't say it, but effectively concede defeat and turn the city over to what amounts to the former Saddam army, pretty much. Why did that happen? Suppose that there'd been a Fallujah event in the 60s. It would have been settled very simply. B-52s, massive ground operations that wipe the place out. Why not this time? Well, because the public won't tolerate it now. In the 1960s, executive power was so extreme, it could get away with anything. Public didn't know, maybe even didn't care, because it was just taken for granted that it's our right to massacre and destroy at will. So there was virtually no protest against the Vietnam War for years, and operations like this went on constantly. Not anymore. Now the public won't tolerate it. Therefore, that's one major reason why the U.S. cannot carry out the kinds of murderous operations that it was easily able to carry out. I think it's because the public does care. Actually, if you look at, I spent a lot of time looking at declassified documents. You take a look at secret documents from the United States, or to the extent that I know other countries. Are they protecting secrets? Well, in a sense, yes. But who are they protecting them from? Mostly the domestic population. And a very small proportion of them have anything to do with security, no matter how broadly you interpret it. They primarily have to do with ensuring that the major enemy, namely the domestic population, does not find out what power systems are doing. And that's because people in power, whether it's business power or government power or doctrinal power or whatever, simply are afraid that people do care. And therefore you have to, as Bernays said, consciously manipulate their attitudes and beliefs, for their own good, of course, always for their own good.
U.S. dedication to democracy is a staple of political discourse in the corporate media, and here and there are acknowledgments that they're occasionally flawed, but the doctrine is one of always and constant good intentions. June, actually, 2004 marks the 50th anniversary of what you mentioned earlier, Operation Success in Guatemala, the U.S. coup overthrowing the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz. Eisenhower, who was then president, said to the assembled CIA chiefs, "Thanks to all of you, you've averted a Soviet beachhead in our hemisphere," again connecting beachheads in Grenada with beachheads in Guatemala. It's interesting that Stephen Kinzer, who's written a book along with Stephen Schlesinger on the coup called Bitter Fruit, he describes what happened in Guatemala in a Nation article as one of the blackest episodes in the CIA's history. I wonder if you could comment on that. It wasn't one of the blackest episodes in U.S. history. It was this rogue agency out of control.
Yeah, that's a good book. It was an early book. It was written before a lot was known, but this basically on target. However, this was not the CIA's history. It's the the history of the White House. The CIA acted, as it constantly acts, as an agency of the White House, to carry out actions where you can have what's called plausible deniability. Kissinger-style orders are rare. They're usually given quietly. Actually, this one, too, was given quietly, but it was exposed. They're given quietly, and the CIA is assigned the responsibility of carrying out the crimes and atrocities. And then if anything goes wrong, you can blame it on the CIA, sort of rogue elements out of control. But that's a joke. I mean, it's very hard to find a case where the CIA acted outside presidential authority, and this is a clear case. Eisenhower gave the orders. Now, incidentally, although we have an enormous amount of information about Guatemala, it is nevertheless limited. Part of the reason is that the Reaganites were who were not conservatives. They were extreme statist reactionaries. They believed in a powerful interventionist state which intervened massively in the domestic economy and in international affairs, and also had to prevent the public from knowing what it was doing. So one of the achievements of the Reagan administration was to block the regular release of archival records. There are U.S. laws which require the State Department to release declassified records, to declassify records after a 30-year period. There's some constraints, but basically to release them. The Reagan administration for the first time blocked that because they didn't want the public to know what had happened in Guatemala and Iran. In fact, that action, so either they destroyed them or they hid them or something, but they didn't release them. That was considered so outrageous that the State Department historians, who were a pretty conservative bunch, resigned in protest and made a public protest about it. This is a kind of a fascist streak in the Reagan administration and demonstrates their enormous fear of the public. The public simply must not be allowed to know what happened 30 years ago at that time. That's more about the, popularity among the public. They hated and feared the public, and rightly, because the public did get to know what had happened in Guatemala and Iran, and they were by no means the most extreme cases, I might say. They wouldn't, people would learn something about the truth, about what the state is up to, and wouldn't accept it.
The coup in Iran occurred the year before in 1953, Operation Ajax. Well, the newspaper of record also had a role in the coup overthrowing Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. The New York Times was contacted by the Eisenhower administration and kept its correspondent, Sidney Grusin, away from the story. And the editors at 43rd Street went along with that.
Yeah, and also the Iran coup. In fact, the Times was just a cheerleader for the Guatemalan military coup. The public relations officer of the United Fruit Company actually wrote an interesting book about this. in which he describes the propaganda efforts to try to get led by Bernays, to get the public to support the military occupation and the press to support it. And then he says, well, we're accused of manipulating the press, but it's not really fair because he says they were so eager for the experience. You really can't blame us for just letting them do what they really wanted to do, namely to support state violence, terror, overthrow democracy, and institute a vicious and brutal dictatorship. They wanted it, so, we helped them, but that's not our fault. And he's basically accurate.
Returning again to Ronald Reagan, I'm looking at a book called Iqbal Ahmed, Terrorism, Theirs and Ours, and it shows the great communicator sitting with the Afghan Mujahideen. This is not a photograph that is being widely circulated in the New York Times or Newsweek or Time Magazine or any of the other major media. The Reagan administration was, according to Iqbal Ahmed and, of course, many others, instrumental in supporting the Mujahideen, who later then morphed into the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, they went beyond supporting them. They organized them. They collected radical Islamists from around the world, the most violent, crazed elements they could find, and tried to forge them into a military force in Afghanistan, which you could argue that would have been legitimate if it had been for the purpose of defending Afghanistan, but it wasn't. It was, in fact, it probably prolonged the war in Afghanistan. Looks from the Russian archives as though they were ready to pull out in the early 80s, and this prolonged the war. But that wasn't the point. The point was to harm the Russians, not to defend the Afghans. So, in fact, the Mujahideen were carrying out terrorist activities right inside Russia, based in Afghanistan. Incidentally, those terrorist activities stopped after the Russians pulled out of Afghanistan, because what they were trying to do is just what they say. Their terminology, protect Muslim lands from the infidels. When the infidels pulled out, they stopped carrying out terrorist attacks in Russia from Afghanistan. They're now carrying them out from Chechnya, where Russia's carrying out a murderous, devastating repression with U.S. support. And yes, similar elements in Afghanistan, some of them are Afghanis, in fact, what they're called, not Afghans, but Islamists who were brought to Afghanistan, armed, trained, directed by Pakistani intelligence mainly, but under CIA supervision and control, with the support of Britain and other powers. Incidentally, it's just, and for the purpose of trying to harm the Russians as much as possible at that time. And yes, they morphed into what became Al-Qaeda. Actually, Al-Qaeda, if you look back, was unknown and not even mentioned in barely mentioned in U.S. intelligence reports until 1998. Clinton put it on the map. Clinton's bombing of the Sudan and Afghanistan in 1998 effectively created Al-Qaeda both as a known entity in the intelligence world and also in the Muslim world. It was an enormous boost. In fact, it put bin Laden on the map. Before that, he was regarded as a kind of minor financier of some kind. But that created him as a major symbol. It led to a very sharp increase in recruitment, financing for Al-Qaeda-style networks. And it also tightened relations between bin Laden and the Taliban, which had been quite hostile before, but they became close after the bombing. Bombing of Sudan, in particular, infuriated people throughout the Arab world. It's another one of those things which didn't happen because we did it. They knew perfectly well it was the major producer of pharmaceutical and veterinary supplies for a poor African country. They may have believed it was producing chemical weapons, or maybe not. That's what people talk about, but it doesn't matter. They knew they were bombing a core part of the pharmaceutical industry. And of course that's going to have devastating effects. It was known instantly. We don't know how much because, we don't investigate or care about the results of our crimes, which didn't exist. But the few credible estimates that are available from the German ambassador, actually in a paper published in the ultra-left Harvard International Review, and another in the Boston Globe by a researcher there, Both estimate several tens of thousands of deaths, which is plausible, maybe more, maybe less. Outside, again, here that's not an issue. Like you can read in the New Yorker, a distinguished literary critic saying, why does anybody care about this? One person died. No, not one person. One person may have died in a missile attack, but probably tens of thousands died as a result. I mean, if Al-Qaeda blew up half the pharmaceutical supplies in some country that mattered, well, like say the United States or England or Israel, we wouldn't say, oh, well, minor joke or something. But when we did it, it didn't happen, and the consequences didn't occur. And if anybody even dares to mention them, it just leads to hopeless tantrums, because you are not allowed even to mention the fact that the United States can eat just, thoughtlessly. It's not really, it didn't even plan to carries out major crimes. But it did put Al-Qaeda on the map. Osama bin Laden himself was not anti-American until about 1991 for several reasons. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia refused to allow him to carry out a jihad against Saddam Hussein. He wanted to lead an attack against Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War. Saudis and U.S. didn't want him to. He was irritated at that. But the main reason for what he says and what Western experts believe is that the main reason was the same as in Afghanistan. The infidels were occupying Muslim land, namely Saudi Arabia, talking about U.S. bases there. And of course, Saudi Arabia is vastly more important in their theology than Afghanistan. That's the site of the two holy cities. Paul Wolfowitz finally agreed that this is correct. When they decided to pull out the American bases from Saudi Arabia, he said, well, we got to get this, we have to remove this element that's supporting Al-Qaeda propaganda. And it's more than propaganda, it's probably belief. So yes, then became anti-American, as it had been anti-Russian. Incidentally, those terrorist attacks in Russia were no joke. They almost led to a Pakistan-Russia confrontation, and those are two nuclear powers. Another achievement of Ronald Reagan was to pretend that the Pakistanis were not developing nuclear weapons. But of course they were. The U.S. was strongly supporting the vicious dictatorship in Pakistan, the Al-Haq dictatorship, which is a horrible dictatorship. Among other things, it was developing nuclear weapons, and in order to keep supporting it and maintain their support for the jihadis in Afghanistan, they had to pretend they didn't know anything about it, which was, of course, a lie. They knew everything about it. Also, Al-Haq was turning Pakistan into a kind of Taliban-style country. I mean, he was undermining the educational system, which was reasonably advanced. He was allowing Taliban-style types to take over a good part of the educational system. The Reagan administration looked the other way. They didn't care, as long as they were supporting U.S. goals, fine. I mean, their legacy is, we don't have to wait for history to tell us what it was. You go wherever you like, South Asia, Central America, Africa, Southeast Asia, it's Middle East. It's atrocious.
In this same book by Iqbal Ahmed, Terrorism, Theirs and Ours, I did an interview with him a couple of weeks after the Clinton cruise missile attacks on Afghanistan and Sudan, which were, according to the U.S., in response to the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya. And Iqbal Ahmed at the time said, Osama bin Laden is a sign of things to come. And I asked him, well, could you explain that? And he said, the U.S. has sowed in the Middle East and in South Asia very poisonous seeds. These seeds are growing now. Some have ripened and others are ripening. An examination of why they were sown, what has grown, and how they should be reaped is needed. Missiles won't solve the problem.
Yeah, that's a very perceptive statement. And in fact, by now there is quite good analytic literature on how they developed. The best book on that is by a British investigator, Jason Burke, called Al-Qaeda, and he simply confirms what Iqbal predicted. He points out what his final conclusion. He reviews a whole series of element of acts in the development of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not an organization. It's a loose network of very loosely affiliated, mostly independent organizations which have a kind of a similar ideology. He calls it a network of networks. And bin Laden, as I mentioned, became, and as Iqbal pointed out, predicted, which is perceptive, it became a major symbol, and bin Laden himself became a major symbol as a result of these bombings. Before it hadn't been. Take a look at Richard Clark's book. He says the same thing about U.S. intelligence. There was no special attention to Al-Qaeda or bin Laden, kind of marginal factors. In fact, they didn't even use the word Al-Qaeda. But yes, Iqbal's correct. What Burke points out is that every single U.S. act of violence has been a very welcome gift to bin Laden. As in his words, every use of violence is a small victory for bin Laden. Helps him mobilize the constituency, which will, he hopes, join them in seeing the West as, crusaders who were trying to destroy the Muslim world, so they must defend themselves. And every act, the invasion of the attacks on Sudan and Afghanistan, the invasion of Afghanistan, again, led to a big increase in recruitment and financing. The war in Iraq had exactly the same effect. Just this morning, the State Department conceded that as they politely put it, they were mistaken. In other words, lying outright in their report a couple of months ago, claiming that terror had been reduced thanks to Bush. In fact, it had sharply increased. They now concede quietly, which had been known before. And one of the increases was the war in Iraq. Furthermore, that was it was predicted in advance that was going to happen. It wasn't any surprise. I mean, intelligence agencies and analysts were predicting if you invade Iraq, you're going to increase terrorism for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, there's a kind of an odd charade going on now in the intellectual world and in Washington based on the so-called revelations of Clark and O'Neill and others that the neocons in the administration ranked invading Iraq higher than a war on terror. I mean, the only thing surprising about these revelations is that anybody's surprised. I mean, how can you be surprised? I mean, they invaded Iraq, after all, knowing that it was very likely to increase the threat of terror. End of story. That demonstrates what their priorities are. Furthermore, they're perfectly reasonable priorities. They don't care that much about terror. What they care about is having military bases right in a dependent client state, right at the heart of the oil-producing region. That's important. And not because the U.S. wants the oil. It doesn't have to get the oil if it's going to get the oil one way or another on the market. But it wants to control the oil. Totally different matter. Those things are constantly obscured. Control of the oil has been known since the 1940s is a major lever of world control against your enemies. And U.S. enemies are Europe and Asia. Those are the regions of the world that could move towards independence. One of the ways to prevent that is to keep your hand on the spigot. That was understood long ago.
Paul O'Neill being the Bush Secretary of the Treasury. The book about him is by Ron Suskind. It's called The Price of Loyalty. And Richard Clark, the counterterrorism expert, his book is called Against All Enemies. We've only got a few minutes left. Every 4 years, Americans, those who vote, are faced with what is often called the lesser of two evils as their presidential options. Dave Dellinger, who passed away in May of 2004, used to call it the evil of two lessers. You say that there's a fraction of difference between George Bush and John Kerry, and this raised some eyebrows. They heard, well, Chomsky's coming out, it sounds like, for Kerry. Could you expand on what you mean by that?
No, there are differences. They have different constituencies. There's different groups of people around them. On international affairs, I wouldn't expect any major policy changes. It would probably be more like back to the Clinton years when you have sort of the same policies but more modulated, not so brazen and aggressive, less violent, and so on. And I'd expect a kind of return to that. On domestic issues, there could be fairly significant difference. It's not huge, but difference in its outcomes. The group around Bush are real fanatics. I mean, they're quite openly, they're not hiding it. You can't accuse them of that. They want to destroy the entire array of progressive achievements of the past century. I mean, they've already more or less gotten rid of progressive income tax. They're trying to destroy the limited medical care system. The new pharmaceutical bill is a step towards that. They're going after Social Security. They probably will go after schools. They do not want a small government any more than Reagan did. They want a huge government and massively intrusive. They hate free markets, but they want it to work for the rich. The Kerry people will do something not fantastically different, but less so. They have a different constituency to appeal to, and they will are much more likely to protect some limited form of benefits for the general population. Well, those may not like. There are other differences. I mean, the popular constituency of the Bush people, a large part of it is the extremist, fundamentalist religious sector in the country, which is huge in the United States. I mean, nothing like it in any other industrial country. And they have to keep throwing them red meat to keep them in line. I mean, while they're shafting them in their economic and social policies, you got to make them think you're doing something for them. And throwing red meat to that constituency is very dangerous for the world, because it means violence and aggression, but also for the country, because it means harming civil liberties in a serious way. Well, the Kerry people don't really have that constituency. I mean, they'd like to have it, but they're never going to appeal to it much. They have to appeal somehow to working people, women, minorities, and others, and that makes a difference. Well, these may not look like huge differences, but they translate into quite big effects for the lives of people. Anyone who says, I don't care if Bush gets elected, is basically telling poor and working people in the country, I don't care if your lives are destroyed. I don't care whether are going to have a little money to help your disabled mother. I just don't care, because from my elevated point of view, I don't see much difference between them. Well, that's a way of saying, pay no attention to me because I don't care about you. Apart from its being wrong, it's also a recipe for disaster if you're hoping to ever develop popular movements and a political alternative.
That was Noam Chomsky on War Crimes and Imperial Fantasies, Part 2. I talked with him in his office at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts in June 2004.
What's this I hear from Stephanie about you becoming a policeman?
You mean Stephanie was the only one who came to my father's funeral? That's Stephanie?
Yeah, that's Stephanie.
Not much to it, Uncle Edward.
Well, you're trying to prove something to the family?
When you say the family, who do you mean exactly? You?
You always have to question everything, don't you?
Maybe it would have done you some good to have some questions from time to time, Am I an asshole? Are my kids a mess? Is my wife a money-grubbing whore? Those are questions, right? Have I ever been good to my dying sister, or am I just now pretending to be?
Do you need some money for the funeral?
When my mother dies, we don't have any more connection.
It's very